But I have a very easy job today. It is mostly to introduce our two MCs and let them do everything else. So we are going to be led this morning by Miles Green, who's my boss at World Relief. So hopefully I do this all right. He's the president and CEO of World Relief, which is one of our lead organizations for the Evangelical Creation Table, along with Liz Van Zyl, who's the vice president for government affairs for Bethany Christian Services. And we are really grateful to both of them for being here. And I'm mostly going to turn it over to them and let them welcome you, give you some basic information, and then start with our first conversation.
Well, good morning, everyone, and happy Friday. Thank you so much for being here, and Matt, thank you for that introduction. As Matt said, my name is Liz Van Zyl, and I have the pleasure of serving at Bethany Christian Services. Bethany is a global nonprofit that works in 30 states and 8 countries, serving children, youth, and families, including refugees through our refugee resettlement programs, as well as refugees abroad. We also serve asylum-seeking children and families coming from the southern border. So it's really a joy to be with you all, a lot of like-minded believers, and I think that we're gonna have a really good morning, learning a lot about how we can get involved specifically with policy and advocacy.
And I'm Miles Green, as Matt said, and I'm the president and CEO of World Relief. And World Relief is a Christian humanitarian organization like Bethany that works both in the United States and around the world. In the US, we are very committed to issues related to refugees and immigrants. We're one of the 10 resettlement agencies, along with Bethany, and have 25 office locations around the US that are engaged in this work. And so seeing all of you here, as many of you as partners of ours or friends of ours in this work, is really deeply encouraging. I love the Evangelical Immigration Table and gatherings like this, because I think it's a space where we really get to come together and express ourselves and live out both the Great Commission and the Great Commandment. And it's this idea that as we come together and really participate in a process of mutual discipleship and learning, and truly gathering and learning biblical principles about immigration and welcoming our neighbors and what that is. But it's also a chance where we can talk about the work that we're doing to go out and to love our neighbors, our newest neighbors in this country, and be a part of building stronger communities really that reflect the world and the world that God has created. And so it's wonderful to be here today. As you may know, the Evangelical Immigration Table is a place where evangelical Christians of various denominations, theological traditions, ethnicities, and political perspectives are able together and talk about biblical principles and be united in Christ in the work that we're doing. And so it's an organization where so World Relief and Bethany Christian Services are 2 of the 10 convening organizations that are part of this. The other organizations, and I believe there's representatives from all of them here today, that we want to recognize are the Council for Christian Colleges and Universities, the Christianity Today's Public Theology Project, the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission of the Southern Baptist Convention, the Faith and Community Empowerment, the National Association of Evangelicals, and the National Latino Evangelical Coalition, the Wesleyan Church, and World Vision.
There is a lot of information that these 4 have to share today, and it may feel like more than you can take in. And so some of the questions that will be asked later is how we can put some concrete handles on this information and the things that they will share so that we can then communicate this to others who aren't able to be here this morning. So I think where I'd like to start is with Phillip, actually, with the numbers. So Phillip and I have talked a little bit about this, but behind all of the immigration and other stories related to that are statistics and numbers that inform those stories. And so Phillip, if you could just tell us about your work and how that then feeds into the rest of the discussion.
Yeah, sure. So when we think of immigration policy and kind of activities that are happening right now, we can think of it, of course, on an administration level, kind of different aspects that can happen at the executive as well as legislatively. And I regularly provide the statistics and numbers to both of these bodies to be able to have a better sense of the unauthorized or undocumented population. You may be kind of have heard over the years that the undocumented population number is around 10 to 11 million people. This is accurate. In fact, Pew, the group I used to work for, put out their number yesterday from the year of 2021 at 10.5 million. When we think of the undocumented population, though, today, it has kind of two challenges in terms of just the statistics that we need to kind of keep in mind. One is, who is an undocumented person today? Is an asylum seeker an undocumented person? Is someone that's been recently paroled in the United States in the past year or two, are they an undocumented person? You know, they do have kind of a liminal status. It's hard to say, you know, what the certainty of that status would be. Is someone that, you know, that is a DACA recipient or a TPS holder, so temporary protected status, for those that may not be aware, you know, are those undocumented immigrants? In the past, demographers like me have included all of those people as undocumented immigrants. But the reality today is the fact that, especially in the past 2 to 3 years, the size of those populations have grown considerably. And many, if not all, have some kind of level of legal protections to live and work in the United States. So these are the new challenges when it comes to numbers that we have to deal with on the definition side. On the actual statistical side, the new challenge is the fact that this population, if you think of it broadly, as I just explained it, has grown in some respects because of the nature of those that have arrived at the border, those that have been paroled in the United States, the growing number of asylum seekers. And real-time data is really hard to obtain to be able to process and put into those numbers today. The challenge there is the fact that, for example, we're working off data from the American Community Survey to get to these undocumented immigrant numbers, and they're from 2021. Well, we're in 2023 now. That's 2 years ago. Many of you in this room know that things have changed considerably in the past 2 years when it comes to immigration policy and in terms of looking at statistics. So getting the real-time numbers are the double challenge, in addition to the definitional component of who is an undocumented immigrant.
So moving from the numbers to the policy, you brought up policy. And Kathryn, I know that you've worked a lot with policy over the years. And so I'd like to ask you to speak to some of this, where policy is, what some of the policies are, and what the status is of some of these policies.
Yeah, so I'll talk about Texas, and maybe Hannah could talk about what's happening at the national level. So in Texas, right now, actually today, there's probably a rally at the Capitol in Austin. I don't know if you were aware, but our legislature is in special session, and both houses, both the Senate and the House, have passed what's called SB 4. It has now been sent to the governor's desk for his signing, so there still is a time to influence what happens with that. He could potentially veto it. But essentially, Texas, if you're not aware, has decided to take on the role of the federal government in terms of enforcing immigration policy. And so SB 4 would allow any sort of law enforcement official anywhere across the state to arrest or detain someone who has crossed unauthorized at any point. So one of the big concerns for advocates is that people who have been here for 30 years or someone who is a DACA recipient, that they're being stopped and detained and then sent back across the border. There's some concerns about how this actually would be implemented, because I think the Mexican government came out yesterday or the day before and said they're not going to take people that Texas just tries to deport. And so our initial concern, and the forum helped with this, is that there was not adequate protections for people that were asylum seekers or fleeing violence or those kinds of protected groups that actually should have a chance legally to present their claim before the federal government. They have added some protections, but I think the still overall concern is that immigration policy, I'm sure you guys who have been advocating for a while, I have been advocating for a while, it's very difficult and there's always things changing. And so then that you would have people who are not experts in immigration law, don't understand the US code and who is asylum, who is DACA, those kinds of things, enforcing a law, and then somehow transporting them to the border and deporting them is very concerning. Beyond the fact that the Supreme Court has made it very clear that immigration policy is a federal issue, it really has become sort of, as we head into an election season, sort of a political football, and immigrants are easy to pick on. And so, yeah, so that's kind of the state of play here in Texas in terms of immigration law, and I'll let Hannah talk about the national level.
Sure, so there's a lot I could mention, so I'll just try to hit a few high points. We've seen just continued inaction from Congress on this issue, which has really pushed the administration and the courts to become more involved in an issue that really should be solved and handled by Congress. So we've seen the administration do more to try to rebuild the refugee resettlement program, to utilize tools like parole. We saw that with Afghans, and we've seen it with Venezuelans. And we've seen continued challenges in the courts, especially to programs like DACA, as we anticipate that that will ultimately head back to the Supreme Court in the coming year or so, likely foreseeing the end of that program. And in all of this, we've continued to say, hi, Congress, we need you to act, and there's a lot of things we need you to do. Obviously, we would love to see a comprehensive immigration solution that can tackle all of these issues. One proposal that we've been encouraged to see is the Dignity Act from Congresswoman Salazar in the House, and it really is a wide-ranging bill that tackles a lot of these different issues, both putting a path forward for those that are undocumented, tackling things like dreamers, but in the absence of movement there, we've also been focusing on more narrow issues, like how can we find a permanent legislative solution for dreamers, especially as we see the end of DACA coming soon, likely. Another we've focused on is the Afghan Adjustment Act, which would provide a way for Afghans who were paroled here following the fall of Afghanistan in 2021 to find a permanent pathway to staying here and to continue working. So many of our churches and our communities were on the front lines in resettling those individuals as they came. And so this has been a big priority for us at the ERLC and many of us at the EIT in saying we need action here. We cannot send these people home. But as Kathryn was saying, it's definitely not a great, encouraging time to be doing that in Congress. Our legislators on both sides really would rather have this issue as something to campaign on, as something to fundraise off of, rather than coming together to solve it. I think one additional dynamic I'll mention right now is a supplemental request that was put forward by the president for funding around Ukraine and Israel, Taiwan, and the border was a piece of that as well. So there is kind of an ongoing debate in Congress right now about what should that look like? Should that include policy changes? Should that just include increased funding to the border? What should that look like if it does include policy changes? There's been groups in the House and Senate both working on that. We are definitely concerned about elements of H.R. 2, which was a bill put forward in the House earlier this year. There's also a Senate companion as well. Has some really troubling components in it as far as gutting a lot of the asylum process, as well as targeting faith-based organizations and NGOs who are working to serve people at the border. So we've been pretty engaged there, trying to make sure that some of those most troubling elements do not end up in a supplemental package or in any kind of year-end spending bill.
I know that we each represent constituencies that are not all of one mind. There are various views on these issues. Galen, I'd like to ask you if you would speak to how your organization in particular threads that needle. And so that's one question. The other question is, where are you seeing progress?
Okay, so the first one is a little easier than the second. So the NAE represents 40 denominations and then a whole range of evangelical networks and charities and schools and so forth. It's a broad umbrella group. Back in the 2007, 2008, 2009 period, we had a fairly extensive process of consultation among our members on immigration topics. Obviously, this is an issue that had come up many times in the past, but there was a more focused attention given to it that culminated in 2009 in a resolution, which you can see on our website, nae.org. You just look for Immigration 2009, which has, I'll just tell you what the 6 points are, because they're very similar to the ones you see on the screen behind me. We call for immigrants to be treated with respect and mercy by churches and by the nation. So that's a point where there's a lot of conceptual agreement, although in practice it doesn't always turn out the way we would like it to. But all people should be treated with respect and mercy, including immigrants. And then secondly, there should be a safe and efficient national, I can't read my writing here, borders, okay? That our borders should be safe and efficient while respecting human dignity. So there's a lot packed into those few words. Especially the efficient part is important because our borders, as President Reagan liked to say, were the doors that allow people to come in and out. And respecting human dignity is a fundamental biblical principle. And then there should be a functional legal immigration system, which we barely have now. And that's closely related to the border question, because the reason we have people obviously lined up at the border is because we don't have a functional legal system that admits a reasonable number of immigrants, both for work and for family. And so you see those two themes. And then fourth, we recognize the central importance of family, so family reunification should be a central pillar of our immigration system. And at present, people can wait for years, even for decades, to be reunited legally with family members. And what would you do if you're separated from your child, your spouse, your parents? There's not a lot of legal options in the short term. And then there should be a sound, equitable process for providing legal status for the undocumented. So that one probably took the most conversation among our members, because we uphold the respect for the rule of law. But the whole point is, okay, if we want to respect the rule of law, then we should have a process in our law that allows people to respect that. And so, as Hannah's already said, there's a whole, and Phillip has said, there's a whole long group of people who've been here for many years. And I think it's important to see that in many countries, there are high cultural barriers to integration, but there is a legal process. If you've been in a country a certain number of years, they'll let you stay. Okay, but you may never be a German, or you may never be a Japanese. You'll be always seen as a foreigner. Here, on the other hand, we have high cultural integration. You can be fully American, but still have no legal status, which makes no sense at all. And so it takes one of our advantages, our ability to integrate people, and it kind of wipes it out by not letting people take advantage of that. And then finally, due process, sanctity of the human person, and the incomparable value of family, and respect for fair labor and civil laws. So all those things, through this long process of consultation, the board came to a strong consensus about, and we've been working on it the last 14 years since the resolution was passed. And we do a lot of work. It takes ongoing dialogue, because we're constantly, there's noise in the background coming from other sources that is unhelpful, to be quite frank about it, as you all know. So we have to constantly uphold and ask people to come back to the Bible and to our understanding of who God is, and what is it to be a human being, and how do we respect that ultimate dignity in every human person.
So I want to share some bright spots because I think this can be super discouraging. Especially for advocates, I think the process can just feel like, what am I even doing? We had a group that went to DC in September. Hannah talked about the Dignity Act, and it is a bipartisan piece of legislation. Representative Salazar is a Republican from Florida. Veronica Escobar is a Democrat from El Paso. And so one of the things that we've been asking our local advocates to do is to encourage their own congressman or senator to sign on to sponsor this piece of legislation. So we had a group that went to DC and spoke with Representative Colin Allred out of Dallas, and he agreed after meeting with the group that he signed on as a co-sponsor of the legislation. So I feel like that's like some good news, and like not often that, you know, and someone who's been in it for a long haul, that it can feel super discouraging. And I think also too with refugee resettlement, the numbers have been, you know, the bar has been set higher. Obviously, there's a lot of like infrastructure work that has to be done to like actually meet those goals. But for me, it's been super encouraging to be here in Texas and to see the World Relief Office expand because there is such a demand now. And so, I mean, there are not a lot, but I would say where I see a bright spot, maybe not in Congress so much, was in the church and the ways in which seeing you guys here, that you care about this issue, that you're willing to go out and be influencers in your community, in your churches, to bring a sort of biblical worldview. That is, and if, you know, the church will be the church, sort of the light in this is that we're not alone. In this work. And so while Congress can be super discouraging, I find that to look for encouragement in you guys and your commitment to the refugees and immigrants in your communities, the commitment to raising your voice, and yeah, that it is, we're in this for the long haul.
We have just a few more minutes before we turn this over to Q&A. And so I want to ask each panelist if you can just tell us one way in which we can be concretely involved, because sometimes this seems so much bigger than us or so far beyond us, and that can be paralyzing to some people. So can you each offer us one way in which we or our constituencies can be involved in these things concretely?
Sure, I guess I'll start. There's lots of ways you can be involved, but one that comes to mind for me is a new program that was launched this past year. Kathryn was talking about how the refugee resettlement program is actually kind of a bright spot right now, after it really was decimated in the Trump years. This past year, we resettled about 60,000 individuals, which, though that's far short of the 125,000 we set out to do, I believe is more than the last 3 years combined. So really are trending in the right direction, and that is a bright spot. But another encouraging piece of that was the launch this past year of what's called the Welcome Corps, which is a way for groups of individuals to come together to privately sponsor a refugee and then help them resettle once they get into the community, helping them find housing, employment, school for their children. And I think this is an incredible opportunity for our churches, for our small groups, for our Bible studies, to be able to come together and love people tangibly as they're coming into our communities. It's also a great opportunity for us to be sharing the gospel with those that are coming. The world is coming to us, and we have an incredible opportunity to love them and share the love of Jesus with them, both in word and in deed.
Well, since you only asked for one, I'll say build relationships, and then two subparts with the immigrants in your life and with the politicians that work for you. So both are important. I think the politicians are the one at the end of the day who will vote on policy changes that are desperately needed, and no amount of love from local church people can change that. So that's essential. But I think for sustaining your engagement with the politicians who work for you, it's also important to be engaged with the immigrants in your life.
And I'll just add one thing. As I mentioned, we're asking people to speak with their congressperson about the Dignity Act if they're not already signed on. And so I would suggest, one concrete thing is finding out who represents you and reaching out to them to build a relationship and then making that request.
And since it's an immigration policy panel, and I'm an advocate, one part of the Dignity Act is the American Families United Act, which would provide some judicial discretion for those that are facing immigration bars because they may be married to an undocumented immigrant. You may not realize, or maybe many of you do, that if you are married or a U.S. citizen married to an undocumented immigrant, you cannot sponsor your undocumented spouse. You have to face 3 or 10-year bars apart. And so this act would allow for some judicial discretion on a case-by-case basis to be able to have a pathway for this population. Because I'm the statistician, but 1.1 million US citizens have an undocumented spouse. And many of those are in our churches. And so this is an excellent opportunity to reach out to a congressperson, senator, if you have that kind of experience, to come alongside these families, these mixed status families, because they live and breathe among all of us and need that kind of assistance just to be able to advocate on their behalf to make this very important law move forward.
Thank you. We have one question so far from you all. It says, with huge support of evangelical voters in 2016 and 2020, for a candidate oppositional to immigration, how do we see evangelicals reshaping immigration narratives? While you think about your response to that question, I want to say that there has been some recent rhetoric about immigration. And this kind of rhetoric many times gets to the people that we want to have some influence with before we get there. And so we're already sort of behind the 8 ball in that sense. So I want to go back to the question, how do we see evangelicals reshaping immigration narratives?
I can at least speak to how I hope that they are. This past June, the Southern Baptist Convention, of which I'm a part of, met together. Each year we pass a number of resolutions that are statements of this is what we believe to be true at this time. In this past June, we actually passed one of the strongest resolutions we've ever passed on the issue of immigration. It included a lot of stuff about we want solutions for those who are here with no fault of their own. We want strong borders with access to asylum. But one of my favorite pieces of the resolution, I wanted to read it, was that we resolved that we ensure that the language and manner in which we discuss immigration policies and practices recognize and promote the dignity and value of all human beings, including those in our society with differing views and those who seek to come to this nation as migrants. And I think that really is a strong statement of saying that we do not want to support this kind of rhetoric that dehumanizes those who are coming here, and we do not want to support that. A verse that often comes to mind for me when I think about this is 2 Timothy 1:7, that we've not been given a spirit of fear, but one of power and love and a sound mind. And I think so much of this around immigration is driven by fear. It's playing into this idea that we need to be afraid. But for us as believers, we can say, no, that's not what we are called to. We are not called to be living out of that fear, but power, knowing that we are ultimately citizens of heaven and that we have a God who is in control of love and care for our neighbors and for the people around us, and of a sound mind. We have the capacity as human beings to think critically and with nuance and say, is this information I'm hearing true? Is me sharing this post online helpful and good and loving and caring and promoting the things that I want to promote as a believer? So I think
for us as believers, as Christians, as evangelicals, coming into this next cycle, we have a lot of room to be able to be a light to a watching world in this area about how we talk about this issue and the ways that we can show something better and something different.
Would you like me to go?
I was going to say, does anyone else want to?
I'm Canadian American, so this is actually a close issue for me because I'm actually an immigrant myself. So how does a small town, rural Canadian boy end up being on immigration policy and this type of thing? I was convicted of it through my seminary classes. And we all share the verses of the stranger, immigrant, the orphan, and the widow. And I think that one way that we can work in our churches, and this has been for my own life, is to not untie those three groups together, or to not untie them. They go together. So some people may not know, but I adopted 3 children from Colombia because that is what God has asked me to do. Immigrants can't be separated from this group, and I'm still figuring out the widows. But, this is 3 groups that I think sometimes we like to kind of silo, but this is an opportunity for us to kind of be connecting these 3 together at this time.
And can I just add, I think an important thing is for people to increase the intensity of our commitment, because when you look at surveys, evangelicals have reasonably tolerable attitudes toward immigrants as they answer survey questions. But then when you ask, what's really important to you? Is this really important to you? Not so much. So there's other things that rank much higher. And so the people who are afraid of and opposed to immigrants, they feel strongly about it, and so they really work at it. A lot of our, those who are favorable are mildly favorable, but it doesn't translate into political support.
All right. Now we have questions coming in, so we may not be able to get to all of them. If not, well, you have contact information for the panelists. But at any rate, here's the next question. What needs to be done in Washington? Since this is a federal issue, I'm going to poke a little bit, regardless what Kathryn says Texas is doing, right? Okay, I'll pull back. So what needs to be done in Washington to encourage elected officials to shift from viewing immigration as a campaign tactic or issue to something that needs true reform?
I'll give it a stab. So to the point Galen was making, is I think that for evangelicals that are evangelical by belief, because there's a divide between people who are kind of self-identify versus those who actually hold to evangelical beliefs. And there was Lifeway research that supports this, that people that are evangelical by belief tend to be more supportive of immigration reform and say that it is important for Congress to act on that. But they need to communicate that to the folks in DC. I think a big part of this is increasing your local officials' field of vision of who Republicans and Democrats and evangelicals are on this issue. I think that there's a narrative of who their voters are that gets stuck in their head and their imagination. And so they think that they are in step with their constituency, because as someone who used to work in politics, the number one thing that you are doing is trying to get reelected, so you care about what your voters think. And so part of the sort of why we encourage evangelicals to step into the advocacy space is to change their imagination and field of vision as it relates to who their constituents are. When they think of someone who is a church goer, evangelical, the idea is they get one story in their head. In the same way we're influenced by the media, they're influenced by the media. These are who's showing up at their town halls, who they're hearing from on this issue, seem to be communicating a certain message. And so part of what we are encouraging is for you to change that field of vision so that when they take these tough votes. For example, I'll use Representative Gonzalez, who is a Republican from the San Antonio area, who has tried to be a moderating voice on immigration, who tries to hold together compassion with the sort of law and order. He gets attacked in primaries and, by other members of his party for not going along with the more extreme rhetoric. And so I think for them to feel like if they're going to take these tough votes, that there are people that will support them, who will speak out, who will encourage them. One thing I always try to do is don't let the first time your legislator hears from you as something negative. If they are doing good things, to reach out and say, thank you for doing that. Thank you for signing on to that bill. Thank you for standing up and raising your voice for the image of God and immigrants. And so in terms of what needs to happen in Washington, I think Congress needs to get serious about this issue. There's a lot of generally dysfunction. It's not just on the immigration issue. But I think we don't have control over sort of their dysfunction. But we can do what God has called us to do. And so one thing I think that is super helpful is helping to change their imagination and field of vision.
And I'll just add, I think telling a better story is so important. So some of you were here yesterday with us and you saw the Across documentary. I think that's an example of telling the story in a compelling way. So it's restrictionists scare people with their stories, but when you meet immigrants also have stories that are very powerful and that also can move people's hearts. So Julie in the back there, just wave your hand so you can talk to her if you want to know more about it. Julie's the producer of the Across documentary. Well worth. You could have your church show it in a series and have discussions. That would be a great way to promote deeper reflection.
As I sit here, I'm struck by the fact that we are a group of evangelicals, and so we bring something to the immigration discussion that others don't. Among evangelicals, there's a pastor or two, and I was a pastor before I was in my current position. And among pastors, there are those in our churches who, at one point or another, go on to serve in government. I'm curious how many of us, and this is sort of a question for the panel, and then we've just got a couple more minutes. I'm curious how many of us would see ourselves as our state and national representatives' pastor instead of a constituent. And if we did, how might we engage with our representatives differently? So that when we want them to act on immigration and make it something more than a campaign issue, we're actually there as a pastor, reminding them of their conscience, as opposed to reminding them of their constituents. Have you seen anything like that? Have you heard stories from representatives that indicate that evangelicals are having that kind of influence among them?
Well, yeah, that's definitely the case. Representatives almost always appreciate having people pray for them. And so whenever I'm in a meeting, I always ask if they would like us to pray for them, and they always say yes. I think I would make a distinction between a pastoral ministry and a ministry of advocacy, and the two can sometimes go together, but I think they're often separate. So if you really want to be a pastor to your representative, I think on a deeper level, then you probably are not going to be, you're going to have to step back on the advocacy side. But if you're an advocate, you can also always pray for people, and they always appreciate that.
I would say also too, one thing I always encourage in people is inviting them into your ministry to see what you're doing to meet with immigrants. I think it's a really great way to sort of introduce them to the work that is being done in their community. They might not be aware of refugees or asylum seekers or unaccompanied minors and what those programs look like. And I think that that can be a good way of like maybe kind of turning the advocacy lens in a different way and encouraging them to get to know the people that you have known. So inviting them to your church, if you have like Bible study or ESL, having someone from their office come and see the ministry that you're doing.
Thank you. So we have several questions. I want to put one out there for Phillip. It says, asylum seekers, TPS holders, and parolees are all included, if they're all included in the undocumented numbers. Can you parse out what percent of the 10.5 million do they comprise? So this is a more specialized question.
That's a really great question, and one that I'm calculating in the next few months. So TBD. Let's go back a few years before the actual events of just the past 2 or 3. DOC recipients, about 600,000 people. We're just doing some quick math here on the fly here. TPS holders at the time, 2 or 3 years ago, about 350,000. And then if you add asylum seekers to that, you're looking at that point, probably 1.5 million, including derivatives, not just cases. So, you're getting close to 2 million-ish. And that's very different than it was 10 years ago even, so back to 2012. You're looking at a population just like a few 100,000. We're in these kind of protected groups. So we're really seeing kind of almost a 4 or 5-fold growth in that protected group as part of the undocumented population. And the undocumented population of that kind of older group, which I mentioned earlier, not the maybe newer populations that have come in recently, and depending on how you classify them, has remained relatively stable over that decade. So in that way, it's about 2 in 10 or 1 in 5 have some kind of protections. But again, now it's a different story. And stay tuned of how we can kind of add those numbers up together.
Very good. Well, we're about to turn this over to table discussion. There are several more questions that we don't have time to answer. Maybe you can, well, I can't tell you what the questions are, but I can, but then I'll cut into your discussion time. But one of the things I want to say is it's good that we have the table discussion because the immigration is a multi-part issue. There's a lot of factors at play. And as you've seen from the discussion so far this morning, it takes all of us to be engaged in it. We each bring our expertise, our perspective, our experience to the discussion, and it really requires each of us to be engaged in that way. And so, Galen, to your point about the difference between advocating and pastoring, that's an excellent point. I would say that it takes both. And so we have to figure out where we fit in this discussion and work together. Hopefully, during the table discussion, we can begin to parse some of that out. Thank you.